pretty difficult for most people when they're reading Revelation 13 to envision this as an actual real life scenario, and not just a scenario, but something that is coming with certainty because it's in Bible prophecy. Most people have a hard time seeing a future not too distant where buying and selling will be prohibited, where there will be death decrees imposed and a false worship system that is a counterfeit, a false Christianity, and a total authoritarian crackdown upon people's freedoms. You might call it a scenario of a massive police state emergence or a mob calling for the marginalization and the death of so-called extremists, religious people who insist on their fundamental interpretation of the Bible, who lovingly and non-violently, but yet firmly, insist on the commandments of God. This group of people, prophecy says, not only will be marginalized, not only will we be a peculiar people as we are called to be, but there will be coming the crackdown. It's been referred to as the potential martial law scenario, where you have a complete dictatorial, draconian crackdown upon liberty, upon freedom, where you have a nightmarish type of police state scenario that really, to many people, it's just taking a page out of the most ludicrous and imaginatory conspiracy theories. Now, when you read Revelation 13 and you recognize the existence of a threefold union, a counterfeit trinity, the dragon, the beast, and the second beast, uniting forces against God's people, enforcing these authoritarian measures that strip people of their religious freedom. My friends, this is no theory. It is a reality of a nefarious plot of evil, and it will be manifested in our day. If you find that hard to believe, like many people have, I personally did the first time I saw these prophecies, and even being somebody who was willing to take a look at history and current events from a divergent point of view, I found this hard to accept and believe and understand. After this session, my friends, my hope and goal is that you will not only see the possibility and plausibility of these things to be fulfilled in the near future, but the certainty that Bible prophecy will be proven true. Many people have been ridiculed for subscribing to so-called black helicopter theories. We're going to look at that and other things in this session and then understand the true target of the terrorists and domestic extremists and these groups. It will not be aimed at Muslims and others who are traditional terrorists today. There will be a slanderous and libelous spin and flipping of this upon the most respected and respectable people in heaven's sight. The commandment-keeping people of God will be persecuted in the last days. We'll see that at the very end of this session. We've got a ton to cover. This is a very thorough session because we've got to build one thing upon the other. We're going to see the martial law preparations. We're going to see that these things that have often been marginalized and labeled as just conspiracy theory are actually being built, and plans are being placed in stages through the past few decades, leading us up to where we are today. Then we'll also see how false flag attacks, false flag invasions are taking place where there is a precedent being set for further crackdowns on liberty. And then we'll see how that's going to flip upon the people of God and upon regular people, not just upon those who are openly waging jihads and various terroristic efforts in our world. This has been building for quite some time because from the point of view of those who are running the governmental structures of a society, they, even if they're being prudent, would take measures for what they call continuity of government in the event of major disasters. Now, you might say some of the continuity of government plans that you're going to see right now go beyond the simple continuation of the functions of the civil government, and they go into complete and total dictatorial powers being declared. Why would I say such a dramatic thing? Take a look at these executive orders that have been on the books for decades. Executive order from the White House back in these are coming mostly from 1980s. Taking over all modes of transportation is declared in Executive Order 10990. 10995, the government acquires the power to seize control over the communications media. 10997, take over all electrical power, gas, petroleum, and fuels. And again, these are executive orders that were put in place so that the executive branch of the federal government can have this wide sweeping, vast power over these various sectors of society in the event of a major disaster of some kind, that these can all click in and kick into gear. So far we've got transportation, communications medium, the utilities. How about this next one? Taking over all food resources and farms. Another one, the government acquires the power to mobilize citizens into government work brigades. Take over all health, education, and welfare functions. Register all persons in a national registry. Take over all airports and aircraft. Permanent forced relocation of entire communities. The takeover of railroads, inland waterways, and authorization to put into effect all executive orders during times of international tensions or financial crisis. Then there's Presidential Decision Directive 51, which refers to the succession of government functions, continuity of government, and the appointing of a national continuity coordinator, outside of the Constitution, of course, in the event of catastrophic emergency. So you can see here the infrastructure being built, the scaffolding being built on a legal level where the executive orders have been put in place for what they would call continuity of government. And you can see it goes far beyond the continuation of the proper functions of the state to this vast authoritarian police state crackdown where everything is under government control, registrations of people, relocating of populations, work brigades, the takeover of the media, everything. I mean, this right here would be, if you had a dictator, this is like the dictator's greatest dream, to have all of these powers in his hands. Now, that was something that was happening in the 1980s, and discussions were had in Congress. Take a look at this video. You're going to see that they refer to the Miami Herald, and newspapers were actually reporting on, during the Iran-Contra hearings and scandal, that some of this was leaking out. Now we have it, we have the executive orders, but back then, congressmen were asking very good questions.
Colonel North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster?
Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir.
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked. I believe that it was, but I wanted to get his confirmation.
I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, I'm certain arrangements can be made for an executive session.
So that was a highly sensitive thing that should not be talked about in the public hearings. Now, fast forward about another 25 years, and we're at the period of time where we had the financial crisis of 2008, and at which time there were discussions again about continuity of government, or what they call martial law. Take a look at these two clips. First is Peter DeFazio, and then you'll hear from Congressman Brad Sherman, where they actually threatened that if congressmen don't pass this bailout bill, that martial law will be declared.
Most Americans would agree that it would be prudent to have a plan to provide for the continuity of government and the rule of law in case of a devastating terrorist attack or natural disaster. A plan to provide for the cooperation, the coordination, and continued functioning of all three branches of the government. The Bush administration tells us they have such a plan. They introduced a little sketchy public version that's clearly inadequate and doesn't really tell us what they have in mind. But they said, don't worry, there's a detailed classified version. But now they've denied the entire Homeland Security Committee of the United States House of Representatives access to their so-called detailed plan to provide for continuity of government. They say, trust us. Trust us, the people who brought us warrantless wiretapping and other excesses eroding our civil liberties. Trust us.
Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no.
Now, Senator Inhofe later confirmed what many people suspected, and that was that when Brad Sherman referred to the fact that congressmen were called up and they were told martial law will happen if this bill doesn't get passed, that was actually coming from the White House, from the Treasury Department, a cabinet level Secretary of the Treasury at the time was making these, I don't know what you'd call it, warnings, threats, whatever. But do you notice the progression? 1980s, it was, sure, we may have continuity of government plans, but that should not be talked about. Let's do an executive session. We'll fill you in. Then, with the first gentleman there, who was Peter DeFazio, he says, they give us a little redacted edition of the continuity of government plans, and then they say, trust us on the rest. So it goes from, we'll give you an executive session, Congress, to Congress is not going to be in the know at all on this. They will have to simply trust the executive branch. Then to just do what we say and pass these laws, or we're going to declare martial law. Now, 2008 was a minor crisis compared to the kinds of crises that we will see coming in the near future, looking at biblical prophecy on that. So you can imagine the kind of mindset, the kind of mentality, and the kinds of legislative enactments that come into gear when you see big events happening in the world. What we've seen just there was this is just the precedent-setting phase where you've got the executive orders, you've got the continuity of government in place. Now, in our day, Defense One reported that there was an authorization of use of military force put forward by Representative McConnell, which would not restrict the president's use of ground troops nor have any limits related to time or geography. In other words, the president can use, according to that bill, military force. He can use the military anywhere on the globe, anytime he wants. That would include, anywhere on the globe would include domestically, with no limits to geography. So when you refer to martial law, this is a term that means the military law imposed upon the nation rather than constitutional law, where liberties and freedoms are respected. And you have police forces that are trained to, read people their rights, and you got the Fourth Amendment rights and the rights of the accused. Under martial law, there's no such thing because it's a battle, right? This is part of the battle space. H.R. 645, the National Emergency Centers Establishment Act, actually directed the Secretary of Homeland Security to establish national emergency centers on military installations, not fewer than 6 emergency centers on military installations. And if you look around at these, for quite some time, there were a number of shut down military bases that had been refurbished. They'd put in plumbing, showers, even educational facilities, barbed wire pointed and faced inward. So when you hear about the proverbial camps that people talk about throughout history and the potential for this ominous future of mass population relocations and transferring people to camps, this is already in the legislative code from the National Emergency Centers Establishment Act. Now, of course, many people in government would be participating in this, not necessarily with some evil, nefarious goal in mind. There are good people who would think, well, yeah, we've got to do something in the case of a disaster. We'll have the medical supplies ready to go. We'll vaccinate everybody in the context of a pestilence. And so good people willingly go along with it, but you can understand that from a prophetic standpoint that this complete and total crackdown scenario could have major implications for religious liberty, which is why we're going over all of this. Now, this National Emergency Centers Establishment Act was actually preceded by an 11-year period where they had functioning labor camps going on in the United States of America under Army Regulation 210-35, the civilian inmate labor program. Yes, under the Army, under the military. Now, if you understand a little bit about history and constitutional law, you would know from an American history standpoint, the use of the military domestically is a sign and an indicator of a totalitarian system, right? I mean, using the military on your own population is something out of the province of dictators and other military types of forms of government. And so to have Army civilian inmate labor programs, you hear Chapter 3, establishing civilian inmate prison camps on Army installations. And that again functioned for 11 years in complete secret. Then the Department of Defense Directive 1404.10, dated from 2009, was the Department of Defense Civilian Expeditionary Workforce, where the Pentagon laid plans to raise up a civilian force to restore order to support domestic operations of the Department of Defense, the military. And that would include what they called voluntary and involuntary, in other words, compulsory service. Market Watch reported years ago also, as this was developing, KBR awarded, this is a big defense contractor, awarded Homeland Security contract worth up to $385 million. And what was this contract for? What would they be doing and serving in this capacity for the military? Well, for the Homeland Security, rather, it would be providing for establishing temporary detention and processing capabilities. It has been awarded a contingency contract from the Department of Homeland Security to support its immigration and customs enforcement facilities in the event of an emergency. So in the event of some sort of, whether that would be contrived and manufactured or just biblically prophesied and the natural turn of human events in scenarios where you have highly concentrated, dense urban populations, you have diseases and wars and rumors of wars and all these things. You also have false flag events and some other things we're going to see in this session. But basically what we're hearing there is, in the context of an emergency, KBR was awarded nearly $400 million to construct internment facilities to be able to house and process large numbers of people. So you can see the preparations being made for this camp scenario. And if you use the term concentration camps, that puts it in people's minds of death camps like the Nazis did with the Holocaust. And so we'll just use the neutral term. We've got internment, meaning bringing people in to the camps, bringing a martial law scenario in. Who knows what that could look like? Prophetically, we know that it will be a loss of religious liberty in the end, and that you want to be fixing your eyes upon Jesus and trusting in Him during the times where people are imprisoned or they are running to the hills and the mountains and seeking for refuge there. But here you have the Army document that was leaked in 2012 for more evidence along these lines. Internment and resettlement operations is what the name of that document. It says these operations may be performed as domestic civilian support operations. So again, the Army, the military, coming forth with internment and resettlement operations in support of domestic operations. The document in Section 3 refers to even having a PSYOP officer. Yes, a PSYOP team, a psychological operations officer and team domestically in the internment and resettlement operations. So you heard me mention educational facilities that were put up in many of these civilian inmate labor programs, the programs we've been looking at so far. Here you see again in Section 3 of this document from the Army called Internment and Resettlement Operations, that they were to develop and execute indoctrination programs to reduce or remove antagonistic attitudes, where they would identify political activists and make plans and execute a PSYOP program that produces an understanding and appreciation of U.S. policies and actions. We would call that, in the historical terminology, re-education camps, right? I mean, you've got psychological operations happening, identifying anybody with a divergent, perhaps constitutional, political point of view, and re-educating them, giving them indoctrination, to use the word from the document. Now you might say, Scott, how could you mention people with a constitutional point of view in this context? Just stick around for this entire session. You're going to see some amazing stuff at the very end. You do not want to miss the last few minutes of this session. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2014, this was signed by President Obama, and this one gave to the presidency, himself and future presidents, detention powers to militarily detain anybody, anywhere, with, again, no temporal or geographic limitations. So just like under the Bush administration's enemy combatant designation, people could potentially, according to this Defense Authorization Act, be snatched, grabbed, held without charges, etc. Martial law, habeas corpus being suspended. We'll talk about the rights of the accused and what habeas corpus is in a subsequent session called Constitutional Freedom 101. Now we have another report this one's from investigative journalist Paul Joseph Watson, who writes, a September 8 Army Times report stated that active duty troops from the 3rd Infantry Division's 1st Brigade combat team returning from Iraq would be on call as a federal response force for natural or man-made emergencies and disasters, including terrorist attacks. This preceded a December 1 Washington Post article which reported on plans to situate 20,000 more U.S. troops inside America for purposes of domestic security from September 2011. So you could see specific divisions and brigades, 20,000 troops assigned to domestic operations. Watson also reported on an anonymous pastor who reached out to the news organization there, and he wrote the following. A pastor has come forward to blow the whistle on a nationwide FEMA program, Federal Emergency Management Agency program, which is training pastors and other religious representatives to become secret police enforcers who teach their congregations to, quote, obey the government in preparation for a declaration of martial law, property and firearm seizures, and forced relocation. Yes, you heard that right. And by the way, the Bible does teach in Romans 13 that we are to obey the ruling authorities. We are to be submitting to the state and the law. And there's also a flip side of that. When there is a human enactment that contradicts God's law or that prohibits God's people from carrying forth the gospel message, then we must obey, as Peter and John said, obey God rather than men. So if these pastors that are working for FEMA in this clandestine propaganda operation are not teaching that nuanced approach, that there comes a time where Christians have to engage in what you might call civil disobedience, nonviolent, loving insistence on obedience to God's commandments and on spreading the message of hope and love and eternal life in the gospel and the three angels' messages. That's something that you do irrespective of the law, and you always want to do it shrewdly. You don't want to have a revolutionary or subversive mindset of sedition. That's just unhealthy and many times is inspired by the great rebel Lucifer. So we want to find balance, obeying God, obeying the institutions that He has placed in this world, the state being an important one. We'll talk more about that and the importance of the institutions of civil government in a fallen world. But there are limitations to their power. They cannot legislate over matters of individual freedom of conscience, religious liberty. Those things we appeal to a higher law, the most subservient, obedient we can be to the greatest law, and that is the greatest king, and that is Jesus. So this example of pastors, you heard that they're in preparation for a declaration of martial law, property and firearm seizures, and forced relocations. The article goes on, it says, in the event of an outbreak or a bioterrorist attack, there would be a mass vaccination, said the pastor. They have a program nationwide, pills in people's palm in 48 hours, said the pastor, who was told that Walmart has been designated as the central outlet for this procedure, and that was at least in his area where he was a pastor, called in by FEMA to get briefed in this secret setting with other pastors to teach people that they must participate in the mass relocations, the forced inoculations, the firearm seizures, the property seizures, all of the martial law crackdown, and it's the pastor's job to tell people that that is of God. Now, I'm here to tell you that it may or may not be. Many times the government has to do things in emergency scenarios to help people, but there's also a nefarious purpose here when we're talking about the total stripping of people's freedoms, and these mass vaccination programs could be good or could be bad. All of this could be good or could be bad. So you don't want to have a singular message saying that whatever the government does in the context of an emergency is good and okay, and something that we should, as Christians, all get on board with and encourage others to get on board with. No, we must be discerning. We must prayerfully ask the Lord what is His instruction for us in context of emergency. So that's why we ought to object to this program, not only because it's in secret and it's the church and the state becoming wedded here, where the church becomes an arm of the state and its voice to the people. That itself is a danger and a violation of the First Amendment Establishment Clause that we should not have government and churches working together in that manner. Here it was reported in KSLA News, Homeland Security enlists clergy to quell public unrest if martial law ever declared. The article goes on and talks about FEMA is going to have pastors preach Romans 13, which says that we must submit to the government. And of course, in that context, the Apostle Paul is talking about a government that is doing good, a government that is doing its proper thing of punishing the wrongdoer. He's talking about specific rulers who are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. So if there were a scenario throughout history, Nazi Germany, or you name it, any sort of government that is a terror to good works and not to evil, well, that would not be the kind of thing that we should submit to. If somebody were to say, disobey God's law and obey this counterfeit law instead, then we say with Peter and John, you judge for yourselves whether it is right that we obey God rather than men. Now, shifting off of the role of the pastors there, this was reported by the publication The Progressive. The Pentagon has approached Congress to grant the Secretary of Defense the authority to post almost 400,000 military personnel throughout the United States in times of emergency or a major disaster. So again, the preparations are being made, the training scenarios are being done. There have been other occasions where military personnel are stationed on highways doing checkpoints, doing seatbelt checkpoints or DUI checkpoints. So that's all part of the preparatory phases of this. And you see it happening before our very eyes with very little outcry from the mainstream media. El Paso Times reported, unrest caused by bad economy may require military action, report says. Pentagon officials said as many as 20,000 soldiers under the U.S. Northern Command will be trained within the next 3 years to work with civilian law enforcement in homeland security. NORTHCOM, of course, is the Pentagon's military command over North America. So we've got, if you will, a latent martial law in place already with the military operating domestically and preparing to operate domestically in violation of what has been one of the great traditions about a free civil government society, and that is an act that was referred to as the Posse Comitatus Act. And this was a law that prohibited and barred military operations from taking place domestically in one's own country, in the United States in this case. And so that is something that has been done away with, the John Warner Defense Authorization Act of 2007. We read that the President may employ the armed forces, including the National Guard and Federal Service, to restore public order and enforce the laws of the United States when, as a result of a natural disaster, epidemic, or other serious public health emergency, terrorist attack or incident, or any other condition in any state or possession of the United States, the President determines that domestic violence has occurred to such an extent that the constituted authorities of the state or possession are incapable of, refuse, or fail in maintaining public order in order to suppress in any state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy. So basically, according to the president's own judgment, he can snap this into place where the armed forces can be used domestically on his say-so, based upon his assessment that the state is not sufficiently doing its job. So you could have that overtaking of the states by the executive branch, by the military, just by the say of the president. So that overturns the Posse Comitatus limitations on the military operating domestically. This also had previously been established in the Military Commissions Act of 2006, which basically changed the form of government in America to a military form of government, where you read that law professor Bruce Ackerman in the LA Times wrote that this law authorizes the president to seize American citizens as enemy combatants, even if they have never left the United States, and once thrown into military prison, they cannot expect a trial by their peers or any other of the normal protections of the Bill of Rights. One of the rights, of course, in the Bill of Rights being the Second Amendment. Take a look at what happened in the context of the emergency at Hurricane Katrina and what happened with the Second Amendment.
Today in New Orleans, they got a lot tougher on the holdouts.
Police department, anyone home?
Not only the flooded areas, but New Orleans' driest and wealthiest neighborhoods, too.
Police department!
The police and National Guard going street by street, house to house.
We need to make sure, too, that whenever we knock on doors, people refuse to leave. We need to make note, call it in.
They say there are no orders to use force, just strong persuasion, sometimes entering open houses with guns drawn, and instructions to disarm anyone inside.
You say guns will be taken?
No one will be able to be armed. We will take all weapons.
That happened today in this wealthy neighborhood where homeowners had armed themselves to protect their mansions. Residents were handcuffed on the ground. In the end, police took their weapons but let them stay in their homes. For many of the police and guard troops, it is an uncomfortable job to do this in an American city. This guard unit occupied a church, using it as a base camp. They had to leave a note because they could not get hold of the pastor to get permission.
It is surreal. Yeah, you never expect to do this in your own country.
Chris Montgomery says he'd rather be in Iraq than patrolling American neighborhoods.
Walking up and down these streets, you don't want to think about the stuff that you're going to have to do. Somebody pops around the corner.
Be shooting in America.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it's not just the plans and conspiratorial operations of a shadowy group, the deep state and the shadow government, you might call it, within the national security state. But the people themselves call for this type of casting away of freedom and establishing of order and of a totalitarian stripe. And when I say the people themselves call for that, take a look at this statistic. After the Paris attacks, 84% of the French people said in a survey that they were willing to give up some freedoms to guarantee their security. So it's the vast majority. Just about everybody says, we'll give up our normal protections of freedom, the Second Amendment, trial by jury, not being spied upon. I mean, all of these normal rights that we're going to look at in a future session called Constitutional Freedom 101. We're willing to give those up, and that's the people's mindset in the context of, as Reason.com calls it, civil liberties under threat. Warrantless raids, house arrests, limits on freedom of speech and assembly are just some of the measures used in the name of security. In France, they called it the French Patriot Act, which was the law in the United States that reversed a lot of the freedoms that we had enjoyed in civil liberties. In France, they're going through the same thing. You just wait till real major disasters happen and martial law scenarios and all of these things we've seen, the establishment of this police state infrastructure is finally enacted. You'll see serious historic events, which General Tommy Franks predicted after 9/11. This top general said there's the potential of a weapon of mass destruction, a terrorist, massive casualty-producing event somewhere in the Western world, it may be in the United States of America, that would cause our population to question our own Constitution and to begin to militarize our country in order to avoid a repeat of another mass casualty-producing event, which in fact then begins to potentially unravel the fabric of our Constitution. So there it is. You cast aside every principle of a free an open society, and you bring in a military form of government. Of course, that's not to disparage the military and people that serve in the military. They just have their jurisdiction, their function being defense of the country, not being law enforcement like we saw under the Military Commissions Act and these other things that have been set up.